So we're going to be in John 10, looking at verses 11 through 18. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. For this reason, the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father, the word of the Lord.
Amen. Well, good morning, church. As stated before, my name's Tyler Whitcomb, and I'm excited to preach this morning. I've had the last few weeks off, so some of you have probably been grateful for that. You get out on time and a little early probably, and so because of that, we're going over an hour today. Kidding. But isn't it just great to be in the house of the Lord? Right? To be able to sing praises to our King, to be able to fellowship with one another. This is a great place to be. And as I was getting ready this morning or this week for this morning, I just began to think about the freedoms that we get to enjoy in this country. That we can come here without fear or that we can come here without, persecution. And so my thought was, okay, Lord, I never want this to change. And so I just pled with the Lord. I said, God, can we continue on to come and do this? Can we come and do what we do here without fear of persecution, without fear of the government getting involved? And so that was kind of, as I began to pray, as I began to get, just that was my cry to the Lord. Lord, I want this freedom for our church. And then I began to pray. I said, but Lord, if the day comes where we would have to compromise what we believe is truth, would we stand firm? But would we not bend to cultural pressures? Would we not bend to any external forces, but that we would actually be committed to the truth of God's word? That there would be no bending in it, and that if the day came where we had to choose either between having the comfort and the safety of meeting here, or if we had to choose between the freedom, or we had to choose between the difficulty, the stress, the fear, my prayer was, God, would we sacrifice any comfort for the sake of holding fast to what's true? That was my cry to the Lord. And so I began to pray for leaders in Metro Detroit. I began to pray for leaders in our country. I began to pray for leaders in the church around the country. And I just said, would we never shy away from the truth of God's word? And so maybe you're thinking, Tyler, why are you getting so heavy so early on? This is typically what you do probably in the last 5 minutes. Not a great way to start. But I don't know about you, but I don't know if you know what's going on in the world. I don't know if you keep up with what's going on in the world. But I want you to look at these photos with me from Myanmar. I don't know if you're familiar with the country of Myanmar, but it's currently been overtaken by a coup. And so I want to give you a little brief history. I'm not a political expert and definitely not a political expert on the country of Myanmar. But for decades, this country was ran and ruled by tyrannical military regimes. And so in 2010, 2011 timeline, the UN got involved and started moving the country towards a democracy. And so one of the first presidents then for that country was a woman by the name of Aung San Suu Kyi. Practiced that 10 times. And she was part of the National League of Democracy, the NLD. And so her aim was to move that country from dictatorship to a real, true democracy. And so the military regime allowed this, she was voted in 2016. And so she began to really make that aim. That was her push. Hey, we're going towards democracy. And so I bet you could imagine that didn't fall well on the ears of those that were in the military. And so the commander-in-chief, Min Aung Hlaing, said, no, this isn't happening. So in 2020, there was a vote in November, similar to ours, November 2020. And And Aung San Suu Kyi won by 80%. She had 80% of the popular vote. And the commander-in-chief's like, nope, we're not continuing this fight for democracy, and so we're just going to take over the country. And so a coup was formed. They began to take captive senior government officials, and they began to get citizens, and then they just started rolling tanks down the street and says, we're in charge now. And so just so we're aware, Myanmar, formerly called Burma, historically has not been pleasant towards Christians. You know, in 2015, Lifeway Research, as well as the Gospel Project, had labeled Burma to be the most oppressed Christian nation in the world. Like in all of the world, the most difficult place to be a Christian was Burma. And so I began to think about some of the underground churches that are there. You know, I began to think about our brothers and sisters that are there, and I just began to think, okay, they're facing all these difficulties, all these hardships, like what's going through their mind, knowing full well that darker days are ahead. Right? That if they felt like there was any light at the end of the tunnel, it just like, boom, something dropped, and there no longer seems to be light at the end of the tunnel for them. If all their lens is this world, that things seem pretty dim and grim for them. You know, people began to run out in droves to get supplies, the essentials, the toilet paper. We saw that in our country. But they're preparing for the darker days ahead. And I just got to imagine, I'm imagining the thoughts of our brothers and sisters in Burma. And I got to imagine the question they're asking is, God, where are you? God, what is happening? God, are you good? God, can you be trusted? And maybe for some of us in this room, you think about all the noise in this last year in our own country, and you begin to wonder, you know, this week I just fell down and just like began to, you know, feel empty, a pit in my stomach when I heard about the legislation that's going to fund abortions globally. Like that just took the air out of my sails. It was just like, God, would you do something? God, like, would the church be emboldened to step up? You know, I began to say, God, how can the church make a difference? And this week, a friend of mine, his brother passed away unexpectedly in his 40s, and it was a drug overdose. And I just began to think about my friend, and I began to think about all the pain that he was going through. And I got to imagine, you know, maybe we go through the hardships of life, and the Christian life isn't any easier. I would argue the Christian life is harder because we have to look at the deterioration of culture and be able to still say that Jesus is good. That we don't get to fly off the handle like the world does. And so because we find ourselves in the hurts and heartaches of life, even if we don't live in the most oppressed Christian nation, we find ourselves asking, God, where are you? God, are you good? And so this morning, as we open up and we appeal to the Word of God, and we continue on in this series, we're going to see Jesus make a claim about himself. We're going to see him make a claim about himself where Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd. And so if you're in the room this morning and you grew up in church, if you have a church background, maybe you've heard a sermon, something similar to Jesus calling himself the Good Shepherd. You've heard this message before. I would be surprised if you hadn't, if you grew up in church. And maybe the pastor that you sat under, and I'm not saying a pastor, if they said this was wrong or that I disagree with them, but historically what pastors have done when they talk about the Good Shepherd is they go and they do a bunch of research on sheep, right? Where they gather all these things, you know, they're defenseless, they're dumb, they're blah, 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 you know, and they have all these things to tell you about sheep, and they come back and they tell you, sheep are dumb, your sheep, God's good, and that's kind of end of message. That's historically how it's gone. But I'm not going to do that. And not because I disagree about our dumbness. I am really dumb. But the reason why the approach I'm going to take, and that I think is just tethered to the text, is this passage is not about the dumbness of the sheep, but about the love of the shepherd. And so that's what we're going to hone in on this morning. That we're going to look at Jesus calling himself the Good Shepherd. And so I was studying this text, I was studying this passage, and I just began thinking, okay, imagine somebody in Burma, somebody in Myanmar, hearing this text and hearing this claim that Jesus is their shepherd and that he's a good shepherd. Like what are the thoughts that are prevailing? Like, can I really trust that Jesus is good when everything in my life is pointing to the reality that he can't be trusted? And so we have to understand, we have to see what Jesus is talking about when he calls himself the Good Shepherd. What's his definition of good? Because if we don't define good, it'll be hard to know if we can trust the statement. And so that we have to, because if we don't, we'll bring our cultural expectations and thoughts into this equation. And why that doesn't work is because Jesus is the Good Shepherd across land, seas, and cultures. And so there's got to be this universal definition for good that Jesus is talking about here. It's not some ambiguous statement. It's something very specific that he's talking about. And so we want to define good how Jesus defines it. And so my hope today is to encourage you. My hope today is to say, hey, this is what Jesus means when he calls himself the Good Shepherd. And maybe that will rub against your definition of good. Maybe you have your own perceived idea of, okay, this is what Jesus means when he calls himself the Good Shepherd. But I'm going to say, hey, let's really dissect what Jesus is saying, because I think that if we do, there's going to be a level of freedom that we can live in. That we'll actually be able to say, okay, I can trust that definition. I can trust Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And so every cultural definition of the word good will leave us wanting more. It's only when we are under the care of our Good Shepherd that our souls would ever be able to cry out, I shall not want. You know, that's that passage from Psalm 23, even another really familiar passage where King David's able to write, you know, even though I'm a shepherd, you know, I'm a shepherd that'll fail you. I'm a shepherd. I've been called to be a shepherd of this church. I'll fail you at times. But there's one shepherd who won't. There's one shepherd who will satisfy your soul to the place of saying, there's nothing more else I want. If I have you if I'm under your care, I'm totally satisfied. And so that's what we're going to, that's what we're going to reference at times, Psalm 23. And so if we define the word good the way Jesus does, I think our shot at joy increases exponentially. And so if your Bibles, let's open them to John 10, and we're going to begin in verse 11. This is Jesus. I am the Good Shepherd. Pause. And we're going to stop right there. And so right here, Jesus refers to himself as the Good Shepherd. And so I think for us to begin to understand why he's calling himself the Good Shepherd, we're going to have to travel back to verse 10. And this is a verse, again, really popular, probably seen it on a coffee cup or a t-shirt. But Jesus says this. He says, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. But I've come that they may have life and have it abundantly. I love that verse because what is Jesus about? He's about abundant life. He's about really giving you true life. And so because we've seen this verse used and abused before, where people have taken this verse and made it something that it's not, you know, at times we can become skeptical. We can almost think about abundant life being a bad thing. We want to explain away abundant life. Well, surely he doesn't want you to be happy. You know, that's prosperity gospel. Well, I'm not preaching prosperity gospel, but I do 100% believe Jesus wants abundant life for your life. He doesn't want his children living he doesn't want them depressed, right? He wants people to experience the fullness of this life. And so I think that if we truly believe that Jesus is about abundant life, then we have to realize that the Christian life is ultimately the way that leads towards that. That Jesus invites us in where he says, okay, you want abundant life? It's this way. Come follow me and live in obedience. And so this is kind of the setup before Jesus says that he's the Good Shepherd. And he needs to say that. He needs to encourage you to say, hey, I'm actually for your good. I'm for the fullness of life. Because there will be days where being obedient to God has never been easier. And sometimes it feels like this life couldn't be any harder. You know, to follow Jesus, at times it doesn't feel like, hey, this is easy, you know, but then there's times where it's like, God, this is really, really hard. I don't know if I can trust what you're asking of me. And so honestly, I'll shoot straight with you. What I mean by this is there are things in my life that following Jesus is really easy. Like the command to not commit murder. Not generally a problem I have. Just shooting straight with you. Other than one time when I was like 16, I swung a golf club at my brother's head. I can't think of another time that you could accuse me of intent. Like that was I think that's the only time you could accuse me of intent. But beyond that, I've never struggled with it. You know, I don't struggle with that command. But I do struggle with praying for those who persecute me. I do struggle with praying for those that, enrage me. I do struggle with the eyes and lust and trying to take every thought captive. I do struggle with, believing that what Jesus has for me is more than what I could have for me. And so there's times where I'm telling you, I struggle. That following Jesus is hard. And to actually say, hey, you want to take this from me, but no, I think this is actually for my good. And Jesus is saying, no, you have to trust me. Come this way. That a life fully obedient to Jesus is the life that leads to abundance. And so there's times where it's a fight. And so at times we're going to have to believe if Jesus is our good shepherd, we're going to have to believe that he is truly for our good, because there'll be days when being obedient is really hard, and we'll begin to weigh, okay, is this good? Is this bad? And so we'll weigh out our options and we'll decide if we're going to be obedient or not. And so the ability to trust and be obedient to our good shepherd. And so if I was a betting man, I'd say more of us in here at times would say we'd have trust issues. Like this really begins to rub against, okay, can I trust Jesus to be our good shepherd? Can I be obedient to what he's calling me? Because we have trust issues. We've trusted people before, and it's led to hurt. We've trusted people before, and it didn't work out for us. And I got to imagine you don't have to think very long about an instance where you've trusted somebody and it didn't work out. Why? Because people are fallible. People are fallen. That we're broken people. And so you begin to, now that you've been hurt and you've become embittered, and you have the skeptical heart now because, okay, can I really trust? We'll begin to ask, so why is trusting God any different? Right? I've trusted before, and it hasn't worked out for me. And so, I just began to think this is probably where a lot of us are, where we would be able to say, hey, I've trusted, but can I trust God? Are you there? Have you been there? Have you ever been at that place where, hey, trusting God has actually not been easy? And I think Jesus has the answer right here in our text. He says, I'm the good shepherd. How can you trust Jesus? Why should you trust Jesus? Because he's the good shepherd. That's the answer. We could close our books and head out. That's it. But it's also the reason why so many of us are skeptical. It's always, we begin to, it challenges our trust. We have to ask, is he indeed good? Can he really be trusted? Because we all have the Christian answer, right? We know how we're supposed to feel, but at times what we feel and what we know are at odds. What we feel and what we know are at odds. And so I believe this morning what will help us is properly identifying what Jesus means when he says that word good. Because we don't want to get 6 months down the road and then say, hey, this definition of good didn't really work out for me. Hey, you said you were good, I trusted you, but we must be thinking about good differently. And so if we have a shot at being able to trust God in the difficult and dark days, we need to, A, define what good really is, and B, ask the question, can we know that Jesus is really good? Is he really that type of good? Like, if we have that proper definition for good, can we trust that he is that type of good? And so as we answer this, we need to come to this understanding. We have like this built-in handicap that has this idea that says good equals pleasure. That if something is not pleasurable, then it's not good. And so we have this built-in handicap to really be able to get around that. It's going to be difficult. Like have you ever, good equals pleasure doesn't work. Good and pleasure are not synonymous. And so have you ever watched a movie that you didn't enjoy and said, hey, go watch this is good? No, if you didn't enjoy it, you're not going to recommend it. If you went to a restaurant that had bad service and the food was not so good, you're not recommending it because you didn't enjoy it. And so pleasure and good is our default position. Our default position is to think that pleasure equals good. And so if something's not pleasurable, then it's not good. But if your definition about Jesus being good is that Jesus is going to give you pleasure, then I'm here to tell you this morning that you'll be left disappointed. If that's all it is, if it's just pleasure, at times you'll find yourself disappointed. But we want to look at another definition of good. We want to look at another definition of good that might help us properly identify what Jesus is saying here. How about this definition? Kale. Anybody ever eat that before? Show of hands. So, kale is just not enjoyable. If you claim that it is, I'm calling your bluff. Because you can't put a big plate of kale in front of you and a filet and tell me one's more pleasurable than the other. It just doesn't work. I'm sorry. Or maybe running. Any runners in the house? Few and far between. So I'm going to guess most of you resonated with the kale thing then. But none those things we would call good, but we wouldn't surely call them pleasurable. But I got this question for you, and I'd like actually to see a show of hands on this one. Has anyone in here undergone a surgery, like kind of major surgery? Good show of hands. Would anybody say that was pleasurable? Would anybody say, hey, that surgery that I had, however long ago it was, hey, I would like to actually get sliced open again, even if I didn't need it, because that was super enjoyable. Nobody lands or nobody thinks that way. And so I began to think about my own surgery back in 2014. I've shared that before. And I got, went in for emergency surgery. I got told at 3 o'clock that we were going in for a surgery that night. And so the GI doctor comes in and she says, hey, we have to do this. It's for your good. It's the best thing that we can do for you. And so we're going in. If my definition, if I took what she said and said, okay, she's doing this for my good, and if my definition for good was pleasure, I would wake up from that surgery and go, what did you do? Right? I mean, what if your surgeon told you, hey, this is for your good, and your definition of good was pleasure? What would you do? You'd wake up and you'd freak out. And many of us, if we aren't careful, we will live a life thinking that Jesus is for our pleasure, and we're going to get down the road 6 months, and it's not going to be pleasurable, and we're going to go, hey, what are you doing? Right? Like I thought you were for my good. And so we need to look at Jesus and what he's actually really saying here. And what he's saying is he's talking about our long-term health. Right? In that moment where you say, okay, I don't like this. He's saying, hey, I have a bigger picture here. And so we know that good equals pleasure doesn't suffice. And so then I want to define what Jesus means by good here. This is a scholar named Craig Smith. He says this. He says, good means what is healthiest for us over the long haul, which only God has the wisdom and perspective to discern perfectly. And so it's like that surgeon saying, hey, this is for your good. This is going to be some temporary pain, but this temporary pain is so much better than your intestines deteriorating over time and living and dying a slow, painful death. And on a much grander, bigger perspective, that's God. Right? He says, hey, maybe that short-term amount of pain that you're experiencing, that you're feeling, he's like, hey, I have something way bigger in mind for you. That the pain that you'll endure in this moment will actually be to give you true health over the long haul that you couldn't have attained without this hardship. And so this is what Jesus is going to lay down for us in our text this morning. That God allows things to come into our lives that aren't pleasurable, but we're going to get a glimpse that he is good and that he has a perspective that we don't have, and it's for our good. But it might not be for your pleasure. And so we could spend a lot of time unpacking how that works, but I want to move on because we've now defined good, but there was something else I said that we needed to do this morning. We said, okay, now that we know what good is, then we need to ask the question, is Jesus really that type of good? Is Jesus really that type of good? And so Jesus will go on and give us 3 reasons on why we can trust that he is that type of good. That verse 11, he was saying, hey, in verse 10, he's like, hey, I'm for abundant life. In verse 11, he's saying, I'm the good shepherd. You can trust me. And now he's going to tell you why you can trust him. Now he's going to tell you, hey, you can trust that I am this type of good. And so let's look at verses 12 to 13 and look at the first reason that Jesus gives. He says, the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them, and he flees because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Jesus says, hey, you want to know that I'm really that type of good? You want to know if you can really trust that I'm for your good, that you can trust me, that you can be obedient to what I'm calling you into? So, Good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Now again, if you've had a church background, you begin to hear this word that Jesus lays down his life for the sheep. That the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And what does your mind immediately go to? You go, he's talking about the cross. He's talking about the cross right here, right? The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Surely he's talking about the cross. He's not talking about the cross in this moment. In this specific instance, he is not talking about the cross. He's going to in a few moments, but in this verse particularly, he's not talking about the cross. In this moment, he's talking about the good shepherd. He says, hey, the good shepherd does lay down his life for the sheep, but he's not talking about how he does it. He's talking about why he does it. Right? He's not talking necessarily about, the how, but the why. That he lays his doubt down for the sheep. And so we don't want to get sidetracked on the how. When he says he's the good shepherd, that he lays down his life for the sheep, he's not focusing in on how he does it, but why he does it. He essentially then draws the comparison between the good shepherd and the hired hand. Right? He then says, okay, the good shepherd's the one who actually will lay down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, when he sees danger, he flees. And so that's why we know that he's talking about why he does it. He draws that comparison out right away, where he's like, hey, why does the hired hand not do this? Well, because these aren't his sheep. He wants you to see the why by giving you the contrast. He's saying, hey, the hired hand won't do what I'm telling you the good shepherd will do. But the good shepherd will lay down his life because the sheep are his. And he goes on even more to make that statement. He says, in verse 14, he's going to show his investment in this. He says, I'm the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. And so here when Jesus says that he knows his sheep, he's not talking just information. Like yes, 100%. Jesus knows the hairs on your head. He knows your social security number. He knows your address. He could steal your identity if he wanted to, but he's already given you his, so it doesn't work that way. But this is way beyond information. It's not like Jesus is looking around going, okay, that's the one with the crooked nose. That's the one with light-colored hair. That's the one with the pornography addiction. That's the one with the drug addiction. He's not saying, that's not how he's talking about it. He's saying, hey, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. What he's talking about intimacy. He's talking about a relationship, and we know that because of verse 15. He continues on. He talks about this deep relationship that he has. In verse 15, he says, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. He's not talking information. He's talking relationship. I mean, he correlates it to the aspect. He goes, just like the relationship that I have with my sheep, he's like, it's just like the relationship me and the Father have. It can be that intimate, that deep. And so I'm left at times questioning, okay, why is the word here then know? That if this is in the realms of intimacy, why doesn't he say, I love my sheep love me, just as I love the Father and the Father loves me? Why doesn't he use the word love? He uses the word know, right? He's talking about knowledge. He says, I know my sheep know me, and just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. He's talking about knowledge. And I think that's very specific because what Jesus is communicating in this moment is that his intimacy is well informed. Right? Where this travels back to what we talked about in John chapter 4, where Jesus is with the woman at the well, right, where he begins to talk to her and she's wanting to hide things in her life. And Jesus is saying, hey, you need to know that I know. You need to know that I know everything about you and that I am choosing to love you. Right? That you have to be fully known and fully loved. And so Jesus is saying, hey, I have this intimacy. I know them and they know me. And this isn't an uninformed decision. And so how can you trust that Jesus is the good shepherd? Because he knows you and loves you and will die for you. You can take that to the bank. That Jesus is full knowing what he's going to do for the joy that was set before him that he would endure the cross, that he knew what he was getting at Calvary. That it wasn't like, the Father pulled a fast one at the cross. No, he knew what he was purchasing on the cross. And so we can trust him because he knows us fully and loves us fully. And he'll die for us. But then look with me at the second reason in verse 16. He says, and I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. Here we see the second reason Jesus gives us on why he can be trusted as the good shepherd. And this is a reason really you and I should take great joy in. We should be excited about this reason. Because what Jesus just communicates, he's saying, hey, there's other sheep that are outside the confines of Israel. There's other sheep that I'm going to go after. What he's saying is Israel's not enough. That the message would start in Israel, but that it would echo into the ends of the earth. That he's saying, hey, I want more. The fact that God in heaven is saying, I want more, is something we should rejoice in. And why I think, specifically to our context, why we should really rejoice is because we're a result of that mission. We're a result of those sheep that aren't yet of this fold that he's going to go after. That's us. And so Jesus' love for us is insatiable. It's not enough, right? He's going to continue to pursue and continue to go after people. And so while Jesus' fold is insatiable, it's also personal. Right? I think about all the small interactions that we see Jesus have so far in the Gospel of John that we've began to cover. The Jesus and Nicodemus, Jesus and the woman at the well, Jesus with the cripple at Bethesda, Jesus with the woman caught in the act of adultery. In John 9, we didn't cover this, but there was a man born blind that Jesus has this real intimate moment with. Jesus goes after these individuals. And why I point out these small interactions is because if we're not careful, what we'll do is we'll see that the masses are following Jesus and think that Jesus is all about the masses. And because he wants more, we think that he only cares about the masses. But that's not true. While Jesus will, preach to the crowds, he'll chase after individuals. And so the crowd even isn't enough. He's got to go after those individuals, that his love is insatiable. And so we can trust that Jesus is for your good because he isn't willing that any would perish. We see that in 2 Peter 3:9 and 1 Timothy 2:4-6. His love for you is deeply personal. And maybe you're left asking, why is the fact that Jesus' love insatiable a reason for him to be trusted? Because good enough is not part of his vocabulary. There's never going to come a point where Jesus, okay, now that I know that about you, just go your way. I don't want you anymore. And so maybe if you're, depending on the theological tribe you would say you would affiliate with, maybe you hear what I just said and say, okay, well, what about Romans 1? Jesus gives people over to the desires of their heart. That Jesus allows them to go their way. And I want to speak into that. Jesus is not doing that saying, I don't want you. Let's be very clear about that. That if Jesus allows people to go after the desires of their heart, it's an act of mercy. He's saying, hey, you want a bunch of money? You want to make wealth your God? Why don't you go get some money? Why don't you go chase that pleasure and find out that it doesn't suffice, that it won't be enough to satisfy your soul? And so it's not Jesus saying, hey, you're gone. I know this about you. I don't want you. It's the image of the prodigal son. The father standing there waiting for the son to realize the bankruptcy that this world offers. And so Jesus is never ushering anybody away. He wants everyone to be saved. There's literally, in 1 Timothy 2:4-6, he says, it's my desire, it's the desire for all to be saved. It's God's desire for all to be saved. And so how big does he want his flock? He'll go after every single person. And so we can trust that his love can be trusted because it's insatiable. It's not enough. He wants more. And he'll continue to pursue us. And so Jesus moves on and gives us this third reason that he can be trusted in verses 17-18. For this reason, the Father loves me because I lay down my life and I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down from my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. So Jesus, in this reason, he says what he says over 3 times. He says the same thing 3 different ways, but he's communicating the same thing. And so in ancient Israel, this number 3, if you repeated something 3 times, it was really important. It was like that you were stating the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so Jesus is saying, hey, you take this one to the bank. This is something you can really, really trust. And what is he saying ultimately in this verse? He's saying, you can trust me because I'm willing. You can trust me because I'm willing. Look at how he says it that first time. He says, the Father loves me because I lay down my life. I choose to lay down my life. Jesus is clearly making the point, hey, this isn't something that's being forced. Right? This isn't something that I'm being, forced to do. I am choosing to do this. You need to know that I have chosen to do this. Look how he says it the second time. No one takes it from me, but I lay down on my own accord. Jesus is saying, listen, no one's strong-arming me here. There's nobody who's twisting my arm and making this happen. And maybe you would say, okay, well, what about the whole Roman crucifixion thing? Like, didn't Jesus get arrested? Didn't he, go under trial? And didn't he have to die on the cross? Like, that seems relatively forced. No. So at this point in Jesus' ministry, there have been several attempts on his life. And all of them fail. Why? Because Jesus says over and over, my time has not yet come. My time has not yet come. And so in the moment in the garden where we see that the Roman soldiers are coming to take Jesus, swords are getting drawn. Jesus' boys are like, hey, you're not going to take him and slice an ear off. And Jesus is like, hey, live by the sword, die by the sword, bro. Put that away. And he grabs the ear and he puts it back on the head. And so Jesus in this moment is choosing to do this. The fact that he took somebody's ear and attached it back to their head, that's Jesus saying, I'm choosing to let you do this. Right? Like, if Jesus didn't want to get taken in this moment, he's not getting taken. I'll tell you that much. But in the garden, we see the prayer that Jesus makes, where he's like, hey, this is going to be really, really hard. I would rather not do this if I didn't have to. But he goes, not my will, but yours be done. And so we know that here Jesus is making the choice. And he said, well, but the verse says, I've received this charge, I've received this command from my Father. So is it really his choice? He chose to obey. He verbally communicated that to the Father in the garden. Not my will, but yours. I'm in for what you got. All of this makes me think of the 23rd Psalm, where David says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And so when I think about that scripture, when I think about David saying that about his shepherd, I just think about, hey, no matter what befalls the Christian life, no matter what hardship, no matter what circumstance, I literally think, if Jesus is our good shepherd and he's the one who cares for us, I literally think we could endure anything in this world and we would have enough that our souls would say, I have not want. There's nothing else I want. I truly believe you could strip everything away from the Christian's life and they're satisfied in their good shepherd. Why? Because they know that rod is for them. They know it's there to protect them. They know that ultimately, no matter whatever it is they are going through, that Jesus has their good in mind. And so if there are darker and harder days ahead of us in this country, our joy and satisfaction is something that can't be robbed because of our good shepherd. And there will be attempts, there will be people who come for it, but we have a security in our good shepherd. And we know that he'll go to any length, even to the point of laying down his life for our good and his glory. And so I have one last question, and then we're going to wrap up this message. If this message is all about Jesus being our good shepherd and that he can be trusted and that he surely does care for us, and that he is trustworthy, in what ways is God calling you to trust him this week? What are the things that are in your life where you would say, God, I need help trusting you here? Right? Like, I know you've got me. I know I'm in your hand. But God, I need a certain level of confidence. God, would you help me trust you more? To live more in obedience to your will and your accord for my life. Because I know that ultimately in the big picture, your perspective, you see this for my good. That you aren't trying to steal from me or rob from me. And for some of us in here this morning, you might be at the place where God's calling you to trust him with your life. Right, where you're going to give him full surrender. Lord, have me, use me any way that you want to. God, would you begin to conform me more into the image of your son, Jesus, that I would live a holy and right life before you? And so God's calling you to trust him by surrendering your will to his. And others of us, we have battles. The Christian life is not removed from hardship. Right? There's not things that, okay, now that I'm under the care of my good shepherd, that, everything is the way that I want it. There'll be times where we're still called to trust the good shepherd in the areas and moments of life where following the Lord in obedience couldn't feel harder. And so that's my challenge for you this morning. And if you are in this room this morning, you haven't surrendered your life to the King of glory, King Jesus, our good shepherd, that's my encouragement. The scriptures tell us that if we were to confess with our mouth and believe in our hearts that Christ was raised from the dead, that we would experience life, right? The fullness of life, and that our good shepherd is for our good. Let me pray for us.